Now I'm reading the book by Arthur Hume, The Scottish Enlightenment, The Scots Invention of the Modern World. Chapter 8, A Select Society, Adam Smith and His Friends. The post coach left Glasgow for Edinburgh at 8 o'clock every morning, except Sundays, loaded with mail and passengers. It made the winding trip through the farms and villages of Lanarkshire and West Lothian, with an overnight stop halfway. It was one of the only two coach lines in Scotland. And in 1760, the trip took a day and a half, but it allowed a traveler such as Adam Smith to reach Edinburgh by noon, spend the afternoon and evening there with friends and colleagues, and then return to Glasgow by dinner the next day. Nor was Smith the only commuter. The chemist Joseph Black, political scholar John Miller, and other Glasgow intellectuals regularly made the same trip. In fact, for more than 40 years, the post coach was the linchpin, one could almost say the lifeline, connecting the twin halves of the Scottish Enlightenment, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Scotland offered a third center of civilizing and modernizing activity, namely Aberdeen. It would play its crucial role in the making of the modern world, too, as we will see. But in the years after the 45, Glasgow and Edinburgh were truly the twin cities of enlightenment and change. In a crucial way, they complement each other. Glasgow was more innovative and practical. It knew how things were made and how to get things done. Older attitudes, including a deep-rooted Calvinism, were stronger there. But thanks to its commercial success, it was also more freewheeling. James Watt, engineer and self-taught philosopher, was a natural in Glasgow. He would have seemed a fish out of water in Edinburgh. Edinburgh was more artistic and literary, more intellectual in the abstract sense. It still is. In the 18th century, it was a home to writers, poets, and painters, rather than engineers and experimental scientists. But we should not overdraw the contrasts. What really made Edinburgh different, and what attracted outsiders as diverse as Adam Smith, Benjamin Franklin, and the young Robert Burns, was its close-knit community of scholars and thinkers who were willing to take up new ideas while putting old ones to the test of discussion and criticism. Edinburgh was, as contemporaries said, a hotbed of genius. It sharpened minds, inspired originality, and intensified that sense of a purposeful activity that every thinker, writer, or artist needs to be truly productive and creative. Only London and Paris could compete with Edinburgh as an intellectual center. But unlike those two world capitals, Edinburgh's cultural life was not dominated by state institutions or aristocratic salons and patrons. It depended instead on a circle of tough-minded, self-directed intellectuals and men of letters, or literati, as they called themselves. By the standards of 1760, it was remarkably democratic. It was a place where all ideas were created equal, where brains rather than social rank took pride of a place. and where serious issues could be debated with. In the words of Lord Shaftesbury, that sort of freedom which is taken amongst gentlemen and friends who know each other well. This was in part because everybody was the neighbor of everyone else. Passing down from the high street, each turn of any given close offered the house or lodging of another writer or intellectual. Allan Ramsay, Lord Kemps, David Hume, William Robertson, William Ferguson, John Home, all lived virtually within shouting distance of one another. Edinburgh was like a giant thinker tank or artist colony, except that unlike most modern think tanks, this one was not cut off from everyday life. It was in the thick of it. Edinburgh's intellectuals fully entered into the old town's traditions of a boisterous and informal society. Given the close and intimate quarters, social barriers went by the board. An English visitor was amazed to discover that the shrine of festivities for Edinburgh's best families was a local oyster house, with huge tables piled high with oysters, over which men and women stood swinging flagons of porter, and then leaping on to the dance floor for a series of high-stepping reels and flings. Edinburgh people, he noted, are exceedingly fond of a jovial company, and it was true of the city's literati as well. Some, like David Hume, grew up associating good friend and drink with intellectual discussion at Lord Kemp's dinner table. Others simply liked good food and drink, especially drink. The closes and wines of Edinburgh flowed with alcohol. Drinking, according to one contemporary, engrossed the leisure hours of all professional men, scarcely excepting even the most stern and dignified. Half the bench of the Court of Session, he reckoned, were well oiled before they met in the morning, which may have had something to do with the shrewd, raucous, and often hilarious comments by judges such as Kemps and Lord Brecksfeld. When St. Giles' bells played out 11:30 in the morning, writes one historian, each citizen went to get a gill of ale, which was known as his meridian, although before breakfast he had paid a similar visit. People did business deals, signed legal documents and wills, organized their university lectures, and planned a father's funeral with the help of a glass or a dram. Many of the city's most important intellectual moments began with a gathering in a tavern, discussion of a pressing political or theological issue without bottles on the table, and the loud gusts of laughter was inconceivable. In vino veritas, in wine the truth, as the ancient Romans said. And the people of Edinburgh, who were great admirers of the Romans, did their best to live up to the maxim. The drink of choice was not whiskey, still considered crude and provincial, or beer, but claret. Plentiful supplies of Bordeaux wine were the legacy of Scotland's medieval ties to France, the Old Alliance, and every Scottish gentleman was a connoisseur, with his own preferred vintages and his private cellar. After 1707, as the English taste for port or sherry began to seep northwards, Continuing to drink claret became almost a patriotic act. John Hume even composed a short verse about it. Clear-eyed and proud the noble Caledonian stood, his claret old and his mutton good. Let him drink port, the Saxon cried. He drank the poison, and the spirit died. A gentleman or writer would be routinely identified as a 2 or 3 bottle man, depending on how much claret he consumed at a meal or single sitting. But unlike the modern writer, he did not consume his alcohol as part of a solitary purgatory. He did his drinking surrounded by charming and lively company, and usually under the auspices of one of Edinburgh's numerous social clubs. There was the Tuesday Club, the Poker Club, named after not the card name but the fair poker, for stirring things up. The Oyster Club, of which Adam Smith was a regular member, and the Mirror Club, and many others. Most mixed serious intellectual business with imbibing and socializing. The Mirror Club, which met at a tavern in Parliament Square, promoted papers and discussion on a cultural improvement of Scotland's landowning class. The Rankinian Club tackled philosophical topics in its tavern and kept it up a regular correspondence with the philosopher George Berkeley. Berkeley admitted that its members were among the few critics who really understood his theories. The most important of these clubs was the Select Society. It was founded in 1754 with the help of Allan Ramsay, the painter, son of the old bookseller and poet. As its name implied, it saw itself as a gathering place for Edinburgh's elite, except this was an intellectual, not a social or political elite. The original 32 members included William Robertson, John Hume, David Hume, Adam Smith, Kemp's erudite colleague Lord Monboddo, Alexander Carlyle, and Hugh Blair. Later members included Adam Ferguson, who joined in the spring of 1756, and Lord Kemps himself. As with Monboddo and the Kemps, most of its titled members took their peerages with their service on the judicial bench. The rest owed their prominence to their pens or to their status in one of the middle-class professions. For 10 years, it was the central forum of Edinburgh's Republic of Letters. A paper or talk presented there received a fairer and more rigorous hearing than it could from any academic or university audience. As one participant put it, the informal proceedings made the literati of Edinburgh less captious and pedantic than they were elsewhere. The astonishing diversity of the views and experience of its members made it particularly valuable. By 1760, writes historian Richard Shear, the Select Society included virtually every prominent man of letters and taste in the Edinburgh vicinity, as well as a host of physicians, architects, military officers, merchants, magistrates, and above all, lawyers. Lawyers, yes, but also Presbyterian ministers. Membership in the Select Society overlapped with all the other important intellectual associations in Edinburgh, including the Poker Club, founded in 1762, and the Edinburgh Society for Encouraging Arts, Science, Manufactures and Agriculture in Scotland, which became the Select Society's successor when the original club dissolved in 1763. It also provided the editorial board for the very first Edinburgh Review, which included the distinguished professor of moral philosophy from Glasgow, Adam Smith, and at the core of each we find the name list of names, all of them prominent clergymen: William Robertson, John Hume, Hugh Blair, Alexander Clow, John Jardine, and slightly later Adam Ferguson. We met most of them before as Edinburgh volunteers in the 45 and exponents of the Whig cause. Now, 20 years later, they dominated the discussion of ideas and issues. They were in fact the great movers and shakers of the city's cultural life. This too made the Scottish Enlightenment unique. At its core was a group of erudite and believing clergymen, unlike the various abbeys of the French Enlightenment, who were by and large skeptics and clerics only as a matter of convenience and income. They resolutely believed that a free and open, sophisticated culture was compatible with, even predicted on, a solid moral and religious foundation. Robertson and the rest saw the doctrines of Christianity as the very heart of what it meant to be modern. Robertson said, "Christianity not only sanctifies our souls, but refines our manners." As Hugh Blair put it, religion civilized mankind. Refinement and civility now meant much more than just polite manners and a fine taste in clothes and music. They referred to a historical process in which the entire cultural frame of a society, the political and the moral, as well as the literary and artistic, comes to reflect the same stimulating and liberating power of a social interaction. Through the complex connections of a commercial society, the mind acquires new vigor, enlarges its powers and faculties, and industry, knowledge, and humanity are linked together by an indissoluble chain. It makes men free and enlarges their power to do good. Virtue and enlightenment move together step by step. To the enlightened Edinburgh clerics, Christianity both epitomized this cultural process and described its final goal. The moral teachings of Christianity were in fact a shortcut to refinement, but only if the church itself reflected that refinement. Beginning in 1751, Robertson, Blair, Hume, and their friends took on the task of bringing the kirk into the modern world, even in the teeth of a bitter opposition from Presbyterian hardliners. The battle raged back and forth in the General Assembly and in a series of public controversies. The old conservatives, the so-called evangelicals, had the advantage of numbers and the backings of rural congregations, which were by and large satisfied with the old fire and brimstone style. The Robertson group had the advantage of organization and unity of purpose, plus the support of educated laymen in places such as the Select Society, the landed nobility, and the press, the voice of enlightened public opinion. They called themselves the moderate party, to set them apart from both the religious extremism of a Kirk that still officially approved the execution of Thomas Alcohad, and the religious skepticism of a man such as the English deists, or their friend David Hume. Their hero was Francis Hutcheson, and they offered a compassionate, enlightened Presbyterianism that they believed would be in step with modern commercial society. The moderates boasted champions such as Robertson, but then the most famous historian in Britain, and John Hume, author of the enormously successful historical drama Douglas. The best the evangelicals could offer was a minister from East Lothian named John Witherspoon, who published a devastating anti-moderate satire called Ecclesiastical Characteristics, which was so well written and funny that even the moderates admired it and bought copies. In one passage, Witherspoon offered this mock advice to the aspiring enlightened clergyman on how to write his Sunday sermon. 1. All his subjects must be confined to social duties as opposed to religious doctrines. 2. There must be no reference to an afterlife. 3. His authorities must be drawn from pagan writers and none, or as few as possible, from Holy Scripture. 4. He must be very unacceptable to the common people. Very telling, especially the last point, which reminded people how Robertson and his friends from groups such as the Select Society represented a new kind of a cultural elitism. Yet the very fact that the moderates' most formidable opponent had to resort to a secular literary genre, the satire, to score his points, showed who was really winning and who was losing the overall battle. In 1756, the moderates managed to prevent an official censure of David Hume by the General Assembly. In December of that year, the pillar of the old orthodoxy, Reverend George Anderson, died. Hugh Blair was already minister at St. Giles, Edinburgh's biggest church. 5 years later, William Robertson was named principal of the University of Edinburgh, and Blair became its professor of rhetorics. Reading the handwriting on the wall, Witherspoon accepted an offer from the American colonies he had declined before, to become president of the College of New Jersey in Princeton. In that guise, he will reappear in the next chapter, playing a very different role from that of a moderate basher and a defender of the old-time religion. But in 1768, his departure for America marked the final triumph of the moderates and their vision of the enlightened Church of Scotland. We have mentioned that one of the moderates' heroes was Francis Hutcheson. Another, at least by 1759, was Hutcheson's former pupil, Adam Smith. His early lectures, given in Edinburgh at the behest of Lord Kemps, heavily influenced their notion of poetry and literature, or belles lettres, as a cultural bellwether, and of a clear, elegant English as the best vehicles for modern literary communication. The model Smith himself had proposed was Jonathan Swift. They were also impressed by his theory of moral sentiments, which reworked Hutchinson's theory of innate moral sense. William Robertson used Smith's lectures on natural law and the four-stage theory of a civil society for his own history of Europe, so much so that Smith privately accused him of plagiarism. All this shows that long before he published the Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith was a prominent and influential figure in Edinburgh circles. He attended the meetings of the Select Society and the Poker Club, and went to the dinner parties of even non-intellectual citizens. As a guest, he could be trying. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was usually at great length. Alexander Clare remembered Adam Smith as the most absent man in company that I ever saw, moving his lips and talking to himself and smiling in the midst of large companies. Once, when he had started on a long harangue criticizing a leading Scottish politician, someone discreetly pointed out that the man's closest relative was also sitting at the table. Take care, Smith muttered. It's all true. Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, just across the Firth of Forth from Edinburgh, in 1723. His father, Adam Smith, Sr., was trained in the law and served as a customs inspector in Kirkcaldy. It was not a cushy job. One of the unforeseen results of the Treaty of Union had been a huge increase in smuggling along Scotland's coasts. His father's frustrations in trying to intercept the operations of local smugglers, most of whom were otherwise law-abiding citizens and merchants, were an early lesson for the younger Adam Smith in how human ingenuity will find a way to defy government rules and regulations, such as customs tariffs, when they fly in the face of self-interest. Here is how Smith would put it in his Wealth of Nations. Almost 50 years later, the natural effort of every individual to better his own condition is so powerful a principle that it is alone and without any assistance not only capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity, but of surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions with which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operations. Words that have made every socialist and every liberal of an altruistic Hutchinson mold gnash his teeth. But the truth is that it was Adam Smith who snatched Hutchinson from the burning embers to which the skeptic David Hume had consigned him, and who tried to find a way to keep the idea that human beings have an inborn moral sense and a natural regard for others alive as a basic principle of human nature. We usually think of Adam Smith as an economist and the founder of the study of political economy, or the dismal science, and there certainly are pages of Wealth of Nations that are dismal. But Adam Smith thought of himself primarily as a moral philosopher, and almost all his studies came down to answering the basic questions Hutchinson had raised. Why are human beings on average good rather than bad? Why do they choose, on the whole, to lead constructive lives, getting up in the morning to go to work and raise a family and build relationships with other human beings, instead of, on the whole, murdering and plundering them. The answers Smith came with up were different from Hutchinson's, because by now he had to confront the challenge of Lord Camp's cynical realism and that of his disciple David Hume. In many ways, Smith is the fusion of the two sides of the Enlightenment. The soft side represented by Hutchinson, which is a belief in man's innate goodness, is a faith in the power of education to enlighten and liberate, and its appeal to nature. And the hard side, represented by Keynes and Hume, with its cool, skeptical distrust of human intentions and motives. A fusion, but also a tension, runs all through Smith's work, a tension that is never fully resolved. It is the tension that runs through all of modern life and culture. In fact, a tension between what human beings ought to be and occasionally are, and what they really are, and generally remain. Smith's great achievement was to have the courage to confront that tension head-on, to describe it and analyze it, and then leave it to others in the future to understand it in their own way. It is this, not his role as the supposed high priest of capitalism, that has made him one of the great modern thinkers and makes him still important to us today. Adam Smith was a man of thought and contemplation rather than action. He almost became a minister, although he was never ordained. He should have been a lawyer, like his father, but when he went to the University of Glasgow in 1737, he fell instead under the spell of Francis Hutchinson. At Glasgow, Smith absorbed the twin tradition of Scottish learning, the study of natural and civil law, and afterwards wrote brilliant and influential lectures on both. In every respect, his education was Scottish. All the leading influences on his thought were entirely Scottish-based. Although he did go to England to study at Oxford for 7 years, he found nothing of value there. He summed up his experience there in his description of the average university as a sanctuary in which exploded systems and obsolete prejudices find shelter and protection after they have been hunted out of every other corner of the world. Yet Smith did not hesitate to use Scottish universities as a base for his work and activities. His public lectures in Edinburgh in 1750 and 1751 earned him enough of a reputation to bring him back to the Glasgow as professor of logic, and then as Hutchinson's successor to the chair of moral philosophy. At first, Smith tried to emulate the informal, animated lecture style of his great teacher, but he soon gave up and resigned himself to reading his notes aloud from his desk. What drew students was not Smith's style, but the substance of his lecture, which was nothing less than an attempt to fulfill the great project Hutchinson had envisioned decades before, of creating a science of human behavior as coherent and irrefutable as the physical science of Isaac Newton. It would begin with a natural history of man as a political agent and end with the general principles of municipal law, political economy, and the law of nations. This would have been a daunting task in any case, but by 1755 it was even more so, because now Smith, like everyone else, had to work under the shadow of David Hume. If Adam Smith is the first great modern economist, then David Hume is modernity's first great philosopher. His literally unorthodox views made him a legend in his own time. One day, after he had bought his house in Edinburgh's New Town, he was going home by taking a shortcut across the deep bog left by the draining of the North Loch. As he walked along the treacherous and narrow path, he slipped and fell into the bog. Unable to extricate himself, he began calling for help as darkness started to fall. An old woman, an Edinburgh fishwife, stopped, but when she looked down and recognized him as David Hume the atheist, he refused to help him out. Hume pleaded with her and asked her if her religion did not teach her to do good, even to her enemies. "That may well be," she replied, "but ye shall not get out of that till you become a Christian yourself, and repeat the Lord's Prayer and believe." To her amazement, Hume proceeded to do just that, whereupon, true to her word, the old lady reached down and pulled him out. The story reveals a great deal about Hume the man, his self-deprecating sense of humor. The story comes out of one of Hume's letters, his keen awareness of the clash of cultures in the meeting between the philosopher and the fishwife, but above all, his awareness, even relish, of his status as an outsider, even with his own country and city. It was not just Hume's religious views that made him the outsider and the renegade. However, for more than 2,000 years, Western philosophers had praised the primacy of reason as the guide to all human action and virtue. Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Locke, Hobbes, and even Hutchinson could all agree with that great time-honored consensus that the job of reason was to master our emotions and appetites. With one earth-shaking book, his first, Hume reversed this. "Reason is," he wrote, "and ought to be, the slave of the passions." That ought to be stood 2,000 years of philosophy on its head. Hume quietly pointed out that human beings are not, and never have been, governed by their rational capacities. Reason's role is purely instrumental. It teaches us how to get what we want. What we want is determined by our emotions, our passions, anger, lust, fear, grief, envy, but also joy, love of fame, love of contentedness, and paradoxically, our desire to live according to rational principles, or in the last case, to recognize the dictates of necessity and act accordingly. It is not reason, however, that teaches this, but habit, a frame of mind that associates certain effects with certain causes or actions. We are, in the end, creatures of habit, and of the physical and social environment within which our emotions and passions must operate. We learn to avoid the passions that destroy and pursue the ones that succeed, in order to get what we consider our just deserts, and gratify our self-interest. A treatise of human nature appeared in 1734 when Hume was only 26, yet it contained the seeds of almost everything he would write for the next 40 years, and the seeds of a new philosophic outlook for the West. Other thinkers, of course, had recognized the importance of self-interest in human affairs. Lord Kemps, as founder of the Civil Society School, had stressed its paramount role in the creation and the formation of all social ties. But Hume carried this to a new level. For Hume, self-interest is all there is. The overriding guiding force in all our actions is not our reasons, or our sense of obligation toward others, or any innate moral sense. All these are simply formed out of habit and experience. But the most basic human passion of all, the desire for self-gratification, it is one thing human beings have in common. It is also the necessary starting point for any system of morality and for any system of government. If Hume had made a dog's breakfast of Hutchinson's moral theories, Hutchinson was horrified when he first read the treatise and did what he could to prevent Hume from getting a university appointment. Hume gave a similar disturbing twist to the question Lord Kemps had started out with: why does society exist? He agreed with his mentor that it was there to protect property. But Hume also pointed out that we are surrounded by a seething, crawling cesspool of passions, our own as well as those of others. Left to ourselves with no external constraints, the result would be a murderous chaos. Hume certainly saw Hobbes' view of a man's natural depraved state as more realistic than Hutchinson's more exalted vision. Yet, no society, even the best organized, can possibly police each and every outbreak of self-gratification at the expense of others. There are not enough minutes in the day. Any appeal to reason is hopeless, since reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, and the passions are the roots of the problem. So in order to survive, Hume concluded, society has to devise strategies to channel our passions in constructive directions, through social rules and conventions and customs, internalized by its members and made into regular habits. It turns what might be socially destructive impulses into socially useful ones. The passion of lust becomes licit within the confines of a marriage, which not only prevents social discord, but actually helps to propagate the society's members. Anger and bloodlust are readily condemned as socially disruptive, that is, unless they are unleashed on the battlefield against society's enemies. The passion of avidity could, if left without limits, destroy all social bonds, as each member of a society robs and plunders his neighbors, and is plundered in turn. However, canalizing that desire and pushing it in the constructive direction makes it work to the benefit of a society. Instead of robbing a bank, why not open one? One can make more money with less work and stress, and help one's neighbors at the same time. In short, the passion of avidity becomes socialized, refined, as William Robertson might say, and generates a sense of property. We can have what we want. When we want it, society tells us, just as long as we do not take it, at the expense of the rights of others. There's no passion, therefore, Hume concluded, capable of controlling the interested affection, but the very affection itself, by alteration of its direction. And he went further. Men are not able radically to cure either in themselves or others that narrowness of soul which makes them prefer the present to the remote, or in other words, the short term to the long term. Men cannot change their nature. All they can do is create social and political arrangements that render the observation of justice the immediate interest of some particular person, and its violation their more remote. Hence, the origin of a government, and hence the best possible social framework within which human beings can operate based on a secular golden rule. I will not disturb your self-interest if you do not disturb mine. This is the best we can hope for. In a world in which men are governed by self-interest, and even when they extend their concern beyond themselves, it is not to any great distance, in which morality is largely a matter of convention and ingrained habit, in which the laws of nature offer nothing to help, and appeals to reason fall on deaf ears, and with an empty sky above, devoid of a divine guidance or even a supernatural presence. This world offers a form of liberty, the freedom of pursue one's own self-interest, and a form of authority, the power of the magistrate to punish transgressors, to correct fraud and violence, and to oblige men, however reluctant, to consult their own real and permanent interests. But Hume had to conclude there is nothing particularly exalted or inspiring about the nature of civil society. What did his contemporary make of all this? A large part of the response to Hume was very understandably negative. It comes at no great surprise that Hutcheson was horrified, or that the Kirk's General Assembly tried to have him censored, or that he failed to get a university appointment not once but twice. But much of the response was respectful, and at times slightly celebratory, even among those, such as Edinburgh's literati, who were deeply disturbed by the implications of Hume's philosophy. This was not explained merely by his affable personality, which made him a popular guest at dinner parties and club meetings, or his elegant command of written English. It arose from his own confidence in the future of civil society, which seems strange given its less than noble origins, and from his optimism about modern commercial society in particular. The work that made him a major figure in British letters was his collection of political discourses, which Andrew Miller published in London in 1752, followed by other collections and reissues of earlier essays over the next half-decade. In them, Hume pointed out that what seemed to him obvious, society's effort to canalize human beings' passions into constructive channels, does work. We do learn from past failures and manage over time to improve how government works and how it administers justice and protects civil rights. The whole growth of the British Constitution from feudal despotism of modern liberty was a proof of this. History revealed to Hume a growth of human industry and cooperation over time, as well as a growth of a personal liberty of the sort Hutcheson and others celebrated. And central to it was the role of commerce, as the great engine of change. It reads like this: It rouses men from their indolence, and presenting the grayer and more opulent part of the nation with objects of luxury which they never have dreamed of, raises in them a desire of a more splendid way of life than what their ancestors enjoyed. Imitation soon diffuses all these arts, while domestic manufacturers emulate the foreign in their improvements. Their own steel and iron, in such laborious hands, become the equal to the gold and rubies of the Indies. Commerce and liberty, liberty and refinement, refinement and the progress of the human spirit were all interrelated, and every Scottish Whig could applaud Hume's statement that it is impossible for the arts and science to arise at first among many people unless the people enjoy the blessing of a free government. But Hume also grew out a warning. Liberty was a fine thing, but it required a counterbalancing principle, something to remind us that human beings are creatures of their passions, and that, left entirely to themselves, they become their passions' slaves. Jacobites and Tories had a point. No society can survive without some stable center of authority. The power of a government is needed to redirect those potentially destructive passions, to punish transgressors, and ultimately to preserve the conditions under which liberty can be enjoyed. In all governments, Hume wrote, there is a perpetual intestine struggle, open or secret, between authority and liberty, and neither of them can ever absolutely prevail in the contest. Politics in modern society, then, must involve a tension between two conflicting but complementary principles: liberty, which preserves individuals, and authority, which preserves society. Authority that is absolute and uncontrolled ends by destroying society itself. Hume foresaw what the history of totalitarianism would teach the rest of us, but he also realized that even in the freest society, a great sacrifice of liberty has to be made to authority, which, he wrote, must be acknowledged, essential to its very existence. How much of a sacrifice is, of course, the key question. For 18th century Britons as well as for us, Hume never quite answered it, although he did. In his essays and his history of England, explore the condition under which the question can be posed. However, it may be that Hume thought there was no real answer. He may have simply decided that the struggle is perpetual, and that we only realize we have gone too far when it is already too late. As a philosopher and as a friend, Hume made a huge impact on Adam Smith. Smith read and understood him more thoroughly, perhaps, than any other contemporary. His own writings would be inconceivable without Hume's peculiar take on the progress of civil society, and on what an imperfect trial and error process it really is. Hume swept away all that was pretentious and sanctimonious from the Scottish intellectual scene. Even his most telling opponent, Aberdeen's Thomas Reid, acknowledged him to be one of the great philosophers of the age. Smith himself probably would have endorsed the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's remark on first reading Hume, that it awakened his mind from its dogmatic slumbers. Hume had certainly cleared the air of illusions and made it free from Kant, but there was still the question of what to build afterwards, and this is what Smith now undertook. 3. His starting point brought him back to where Hutcheson and Hume had first diverged. What makes us good? Is morality inborn, as Hutcheson insisted, a gift from God and nature? Or is it something that has to be imposed from outside, as Hume suggested? A system of punishment and reward that mold us into creatures fit for society. As he shuttled back and forth between Edinburgh and Glasgow in the 1750, lecturing to students at one end and listening to papers at the Select Society at the other, Smith was thinking of ways to resuscitate Hutcheson's original notion of an innate moral sense. But if Hutcheson had been right in one sense, that morality is something we carry inside us from birth, he had forgotten about the need for what Smith would call the awful virtues: discipline, self-restraint, moral rectitude, and righteous anger at wrongdoers. The virtues of the ancient Stoics and of the Calvinist Kirk were just as necessary to life in society as were civility and compassion, because they policed the sometimes volatile frontiers of our dealings with others. How ironic it must have seemed that the clergyman Hutcheson should overlook their importance, and that the skeptical agnostic Hume should understand how they contained and channeled our most explosive impulses. In fact, Smith was trying to build a notion of an inborn moral sense that was more basic and instinctual and less abstract than his former teacher's notion. He eventually found it in what he called fellow feeling, a natural sense of identification with other human beings. When we see someone suffer, we suffer. When we see others happy and celebrating their good fortune, it raises our own spirits. To be a social creature, part of the world of man, is to experience the joy and sorrow and the pleasure and pain of others. The fellow feeling and identification with others leads to our first moral judgment. We use it first to judge other actions towards us. What makes me feel happy is good, and what makes me sad is bad. And then our own actions towards others, as we watch their reaction. Then finally, we use it to judge the motivating passions behind those actions. Here Smith accepted Hume's basic point, that human beings were largely governed by their passions, not reason. Society acts as a mirror to our inner self by reflecting back to us the reaction of others, and becomes our guide to what is good and evil in the world. Were it possible, Smith wrote, that a human creature could grow up to manhood in a solitary place without any communication with his own species, he could no more think of his own character than of the beauty or deformity of his own face. Bring him into society, however, Smith stated, and he is immediately provided with the mirror which he wanted before. he will see that some of his passions, anger for example, or lust, trigger other people's disgust and disapproval, while others, bravery in the face of adversity or love or fame, get the opposite response. We learn to adjust our passions accordingly. We internalize that approval and disapproval and concentrate ourselves on those that make us loved by others and by ourselves. H.L. Mencken once defined conscience as a little voice that says someone might be watching. For Smith's theory of moral sentiments, that someone is myself, my social self. When I endeavor to examine my own conduct, he wrote, I divide myself, as it were, into two persons. The first is the spectator, whose sentiments with regard to my own conduct I endeavor to enter into by placing myself in his situation and by considering how it could appear to me when seen from that particular point of view. The second is the agent, the person whom I properly call myself. The first is the judge, the second the person judged of. The moral human being is by nature a divided self, united by the voice of a conscience, which is the voice of others who watch and listen and judge. Postmodern morality tells us constantly, don't be judgmental. Yet Adam Smith was saying that being judgmental is the essence of what makes us more moral beings. It is also about being accountable to ourselves as well as to others. Nature, when she formed man for society, Smith explained, endured him with an original desire to please and an original aversion to offend his brethren. She taught him to feel pleasure in their favorable and pain in their unfavorable regard. But again, the approval of others is not enough for itself. We are not by nature entirely other-directed beings. We also need to meet the approval of our own inner judging self, which understands when we really are what we approve in other people, honest, trustworthy, generous, compassionate. It is the capacity for self-judgment that Smith argued makes us really fit for society. So being moral requires an interplay of imagination. It demands that we put ourselves in another person's place and put another person, someone making judgments, in our place. It leads us to promote the well-being of others by making them as happy as ourselves. Here, Hutchinson's altruistic instincts come back into play. At the same time, we want others to leave our own happiness undisturbed. And here, Smith gave a more sympathetic account of Hume's golden rule. I will leave you alone if you leave me alone, so that we can both be happy. This then becomes the mission of a good government. The wisdom of every state or commonwealth endeavors, as well as it can, to employ the force of the society to restrain those who are subject to its authority from hurting or disturbing the happiness of one another. The rules which it establishes for this purpose constitute the civil and criminal law of each state, and a sacred and religious regard not to hurt or disturb in any respect the happiness of our neighbor constitutes the character of the perfectly innocent and just man. Hutchinson and Hume at last find common ground. Let me stop here. The rest will be read next time.